Whenever there's a murder, it's the job of detectives to find out who the killer is and how they killed. And often it's forensic evidence which provides the clues.
The finding of his DNA wasn't just on the murder weapon, it was on a most important part of the murder weapon.
This evidence was the breakthrough that we needed.
The forensic evidence in this case was crucial.
In this series, we shine a light on how cutting-edge forensic techniques and the power of science brought the most dangerous killers to justice.
A truly horrific criminal, a monster.
It's a hammer blow. You don't know how you're going to carry on.
We'll hear how some of the most disturbing crimes were solved, thanks to the tiniest fragments of evidence.
He basically said to me, she's in the house, go and find her.
The amount of blood that was there indicated that there was a frenzied attack.
There was no reasonable explanation for them. That's why he changed his plea.
And how even the most forensically aware of killers couldn't beat the experts and hide their crimes.
The key thing about having a DNA profile is you've got probably the sharpest tool in the box.
I was so elated beforehand. We didn't have the evidence, and all of a sudden, we'd cracked it.
In this episode, a tight-knit community of friendly neighbours discover why their friend has been missing.
They glanced through the bedroom door. They could see that her body was in the bed.
Forensic evidence that can lead to only one conclusion.
In the context of somebody tied up with an electrode fixed somewhere, like the toe, hinted at electrical torture.
And a midnight call signalling one family's nightmare.
I took Dad aside and told him that I was dead.
This is Forensics, Catching the Killer.
I was 14 at the time. I was living with my mum and dad. Dad was a fisherman and that, and I loved my school and my friends, so it's a sort of close community. And it was just really nice to live at the time. It was nice.
In 1984, 14-year-old Nicola Scott was living with her family in the Scottish coastal town of Dunbar, less than 50 kilometres east of the capital, Edinburgh.
That night I had been with my friends at the time, and I went home and nobody was in the house, and I thought I'm quite peckish, you know, and the dog was there. Well, the dog comes everywhere with me, and we went up the street to the chip shop, which is in the main high street, and that's where I met him, outside the chip shop.
The man she met was a family friend of Nicola's, and someone who both she and her parents trusted.
So we went down the harbour, and I was going to go right round and then back to my house. And that's when he said to me, we walked down the harbour, past the Castle pub, and then you go past the other pub, the Jersey, and he says, oh, Nicky, come in, I'll show you the glass at my house. He opened his door and he says, come in and I'll show you the glass. I just walked in, never thought anything. There was no lights, and then the next minute I had a knife at my throat. I was petrified. I just started shaking. The dog was barking, and that's when he told me he was going to kill my dog. And he sort of led me. I don't know if it was a living room, because the house was absolutely pitch black. But the smell, that's what I can mind. It was absolutely stinking. And I still had the knife at my throat. And then he must have put me through, which was, I don't know if it was a bedroom, because I couldn't see at all. So he was just leading me. And he made me take my clothes off myself. And then he forced me on the bed, and that's when he must have had ropes. And that's when he tied me up.
During the attack, Nicola was sexually assaulted and smothered.
With being a fisherman, he knew all about the ropes, can they tie ropes and everything? He knew all about that, so when I was tied up, he tried to suffocate me 2 or 3 times with a pillow. That was horrible because I couldn't breathe, and when he was doing that, I thought, that's it, I'm gone. But he was quite shouting and violent, you know, and at the time I just kept saying, look, just let me go, I'll not tell anybody, you know, I'll not say nothing. It's weird, the things that race through your mind, you know, at the time you're thinking, am I going to see my mum again? Or I thought, this is it, I'm away, he's not going to let me out of here, I reckon, what's going to happen, you know? But it was horrible.
To her surprise, the attacker released Nicola. Still terrified, she made it to his front door, and once outside, back towards her home.
I didn't look behind, but I tried to look 2 or 3 times behind, and I could see him following me, but I just thought, keep walking, just keep going. And then when I got to the road end, which there's a garage, I thought, right, I'll have a quick look, and he had just disappeared.
Once in the safety of her home, the teenager couldn't hide the terror of what she'd gone through.
Told my dad everything. I burst into tears, and my dad just got his clothes on and went out looking for him. And then I had a bath because I just felt absolutely disgusting. It was degrading me, just made me feel dirty. I just felt, you know, somebody older than me that's somebody that age can attack a young girl, that I just couldn't believe somebody that I trusted could do that to my family after my dad giving him a job and being on the lifeboat and everything. He was well known about the community as well in the harbour, and everybody got on with him as well, you know. I just couldn't take it in, you know.
Unable to find the attacker, Nicola's father took her to local police to report the incident. But the man who assaulted her had fled Dunbar, and with a lack of evidence, no charge was ever brought. What did remain for Nicola was fear and trauma.
I used to have nightmares for weeks. I used to have nightmares about it. It was terrible. I used to think, he's got to come and get her, he's got to sit outside the house. I never went to school for a wee while after it either. After that, he just totally disappeared, you know. It was crazy.
"15 years later, and the man who attacked Nicola would resurface. It's April 1999. The location, one of Edinburgh's toughest housing estates.
1999, Muirhouse unfortunately had a really bad reputation as being a crime-ridden, socially deprived estate.
Jane Hamilton was a journalism student in the Scottish capital.
So there was a really vibrant community, and there was a lot of, community activism going on to try and better the area, and a lot of good people lived there.
It was that close-knit community who noticed that one of their neighbours, 46-year-old Elaine Colley, hadn't been seen around for a while.
This was the Easter holiday weekend, and she was very, very friendly with one lady that lived nearby, very close, and one gentleman, as in just purely a friendship with these people, but she saw them. So they got a wee bit concerned collectively that they hadn't seen her for a couple of days.
Bert Swanson was the Detective Chief Inspector on call at the city's Leith police station at the time.
They are alert enough to realise that something is amiss here. It's been near 4 days, and we see this lady every day, and she's not said she's going away or anything. So that was triggering something, and then they've come together and said, can we look through the letterbox And when they look through a letterbox the first time, the gentleman on his own, he has a look and he sees that the flower pot is over. But that in itself, to him, something may have just toppled over as she's left. So that doesn't spark it. But he then gets in touch with this other lady who lives nearby, who's a very close friend of Elaine's. So when he relays that to her and says, can you come up with me? And she's got a spare set of keys, so better still. So they go up and they then knock on the door and there's no reply, so they turn the key and they go in. And when they glanced through the bedroom door, they could see that her body was in the bed, and it's clear that she's dead, and all is clearly not as it should be.
On the 5th of April 1999, police in Scotland had been called to the home of 46-year-old Elaine Colley on the Edinburgh housing estate of Muir House. Elaine's neighbours had found her dead in her home, having not been seen for a few days. Her closest family members, namely her brother, sister-in-law and nephew, were living in New Zealand.
We received it, I think, possibly midnight, 1 o'clock New Zealand time. I'd just gone to bed. You're sort of waking up out of a stupor effectively, and you just hear, that Elaine's dead. I don't sort of recall too much in terms of what I was told. I certainly recall that we weren't given any sort of details that it was a murder. And then it was a case of obviously getting clothes on and going down to where my parents were and telling them, which was exceptionally hard. Yeah, it was. My wife sort of went to see my mother, and I took Dad aside and told him that Elaine was dead. Being so far away, there's a sense of slight disbelief, but also knowing that it must be true. So.
As police began to investigate, they discovered a well-liked woman with cultural interests and who lived a happy, independent life.
She was a legal secretary for most of her working life. She loved arts, poetry, music. And she would visit her friend regularly because they lived just, literally yards away from each other.
She was definitely well known, and was well known at the local corner shop as well. On very good friendly terms with everyone. While she only had a sort of small group of friends, just a lovely, quiet lady who sort of lived life on her terms. Somebody who was quite content in the life that she had sort of made for herself, and she loved Edinburgh to bits. And I used to arrive in Edinburgh, and nothing was ever too much trouble. I was in my early 20s and could look after myself, but she'd make sure that she was at Waverley Station to meet me, make sure that she'd come to see me off at Waverley Station and stuff like that. So, she really, like I said, nothing was too much trouble for her.
The task now was to determine how Elaine died. Crime scene investigator Tom Finney was one of the first to enter her flat.
We were called here regarding a suspicious death at that particular time. I went in, carried out a visual examination, and the first thing that struck me, there was an overturned pot plant in the hallway. There was some earth strewn along the hallway, and also appeared to be drag marks in the carpet, along the carpet in the hallway. We entered the bedroom area, and Elaine was lying in her bed, duvet cover covering her. But I started to note one or two items on the bedroom floor. There's small pieces of plastic lying adjacent to the bed. There was a couple of smears of blood on the duvet cover. Some blue fibres were also noted.
And there were other small clues which the forensic teams and detectives quickly became aware of.
Looking closely at the bed itself, I could see that there was an electric blanket on the bed, but the cable was missing from the point of the control box, the switch, and it had the appearance that the cable had been cut. So there was a stretch missing and there was nothing in the socket. There was trousers which was on the ground, basically in a heap, and that in itself, makes you look at something. We're talking here, remember, about a person. Everything else that I had seen and observed was in keeping with this as a fastidious, a tidy person. But there's these things that's just slightly out of sync with that.
The clues weren't just found in Elaine's bedroom.
There were one or two items lying on the living room floor. Included was a pair of spectacles, an unusual place, just almost lying in the, just on the floor. The rest of the house was very tidy. One or two drawers had been opened, one or two things lying on the floor, but she looked like she'd gone to bed. There was a cup of tea sitting on her bedside cabinet. So, by all intents and purposes, it looked like she'd just gone to bed. And obviously it's come to some, natural death. But the gut reaction, there is obviously something going on in that scene that is not normal. There's too many factors starting to add up. So the forensic team start to obviously formulate a feel for the whole thing. And at that stage we thought we were dealing with a homicide.
Realising this might be a suspicious death, pathologist Basil Perdue was called to the flat to make his initial assessment and preserve forensic evidence before Elaine's body was moved.
There was a lot of bruising on the arms, and it had band-like bruising around both wrists, or at least part-way around both wrists. For practical purposes, you can't bruise a dead body. It's not something that's happened after death. These bruises have happened while Elaine was alive, and it suggests she may well have been manhandled. And that tended to support the idea that she'd quite possibly been tied up or restrained in some way with ligatures, in other words, bindings of some kind.
While some things remained unclear, the pathologist's team were able to provide other answers.
They weren't able clearly to give a definitive cause of death because of the state of the decomposition. But they were clear here that there was what appeared to be two blunt trauma injuries to the head.
And it also transpired that Elaine had been subjected to a terrible sexual assault. But the most shocking discovery of all was so tiny, it could very easily have been missed.
There was a particular mark which caught my interest very strongly indeed, which was a mark on the inside of the right little toe. And what it was on the back of the toe. It was 3 millimetres in width, and it was about half an inch, 1.2 centimetres in length. And looking at it, I thought it might be an electric mark. When electricity comes into contact with human skin, it can leave distinctive markings. Now, we were looking at a body that was decomposing, which makes things difficult. And I still felt that we ought to treat this as an electric mark because I was highly suspicious of it. It's a very strange place to see a mark of that sort, and it was partly encircling the toe.
Skin samples were taken from Elaine's toe and sent to the laboratory for further testing, and the results were even more surprising.
So we'd found heat coagulation and copper deposits on the skin. The preservative fluid we use to prepare the skin to be able to examine it ourselves doesn't contain copper, so it can't have come from there. The human body itself contains only infinitesimal amounts of copper. You do need a little tiny bit of it, but not enough to have a deposit of this size in the skin. So it has to be something that's come from outside. It's got to be extraneous copper. If you wrap a wire around your finger or any other part of your body, it doesn't deposit enough copper to be detected. It simply can't be picked up. It's just too little. However, if it's a live conductor at mains voltage, then it will deposit copper. So our findings strongly suggested to us that what we were dealing with was a live conductor wrapped round the right little toe and acting as a static electrode.
As the pathologists and detectives realised, this could mean only one thing.
One uses the word torture very sparingly, if at all, in autopsies, but in the context of somebody tied up with an electrode fixed somewhere, like the toe, and another one capable of being applied to different bits of the body, we said it hinted at electrical torture.
In April 1999, police in Edinburgh had found the body of a 46-year-old woman, Elaine Colley, in bed in her flat. She had suffered blunt force trauma to her head and had been sexually assaulted. But most terrifying of all were signs that Elaine had been tortured with electrocution, using the cable from an electric blanket. Detectives knew there was a killer on the loose, and the local community wondered if that person was in their midst.
We had got word that there had been a murder not far from where we were studying, so of course, everybody was a bit frightened because this was an unusual murder. It wasn't to do with drugs, and it wasn't a domestic, so it was, it caused a bit of a stir because, people were wondering, oh my goodness, what's happened? Is there a serial killer on the loose? It was very quickly, there were rumours that somebody was going about massacring young women.
But how could someone living in a highly populated housing estate have been tortured and murdered in her own home with neighbours and other flats surrounding her on all sides?
It was a block, and from memory it had 16 flats, so I think it was 4 on each level. It is a standard and common stair that gives access to each of those. Now, although there were 16 flats, they weren't all occupied. The people there and in that area, to be perfectly honest, tended to keep themselves to themselves, so it was not unusual. Nobody actually heard anything.
With no vital information from neighbours, detectives would now rely on forensic evidence collected from Elaine's home to help identify who might have tortured and then killed her.
We carried out an examination of the spectacles recovered from the living room area back in the identification branch, and we found a fingerprint on the lens of one of the lenses of the spectacles. That fingerprint would obviously be compared against Elaine Colley's fingerprints to eliminate, because it quite possibly could be hers, but in this particular instance it wasn't Elaine's, so there was a very good chance whoever had assaulted her, it could be their fingerprint.
Elaine's glasses weren't the only place where key fingerprints were found.
We also found a set of prints low down on the bedroom door, and that led into where Elaine had been recovered, body had been recovered. The supposition was that she had possibly been dragged through the hallway, and when she entered into the bedroom area, she had possibly grabbed out and tried to hold to stop herself being dragged and held onto the bedroom door. And that clearly is supposition, but having fingerprints that low down on the bedroom door tended to indicate that it wasn't a natural position for the fingerprints to be in.
Elaine's highly organised life and home would yield much of the information DCI Bert Swanson's team would need in piecing together her last movements.
The main house keys was missing. There was no keys now. You know, when we were chatting and getting statements from people, we know that she came in just before 4 o'clock on this particular day. So she obviously had her keys to get into the house. So where are they? The good thing about Elaine in this particular case was the fact that she was a very meticulous person, a very tidy person. She had worked in an accountant's office. I believe she worked for solicitors at one stage and that. So all her records and that was very, very good. So when it comes to banking information, for instance, we were able to find information from her files that will still be there. So that at least leads us straight into the bank. And in this particular case, from that process, we found that there was 2 bank cards missing. That account was accessed. And the good thing then was that we were in the stage where the ATMs were having the camera. Not the best quality, I should add, but you were getting some footage as well.
And other records provided yet more vital clues that detectives needed.
They checked her telephone to see where the last phone call was made to. It led them to a house about 1.5 miles away from where Elaine actually lived. The house belonged to a woman, and police officers visited this woman to speak to her to ascertain what the phone call was about and how she knew Elaine Colley. During the course of that interview, it then emerged that the woman actually lived with a man, and that man was John Jock Reid.
Now, police needed to understand just who was John or Jock Reid and what was his connection to Elaine.
So John Jock Reid was originally from Dunbar in East Lothian. He didn't live specifically in Muirhouse, he lived in West Granton, which was about 1.5 miles away from Muirhouse. He had an extensive criminal record, mostly for drunken behaviour, assaults and petty theft. He'd been in and out of prison for various things, but nothing what we would regard as being serious.
But it soon emerged that Reid had a very strong alibi.
He was arrested the same night as Elaine's death. They, in fact, arrested him for being drunk and incapable. He's been sentenced the following morning, on a Saturday morning, to 4 months in prison, so he's incarcerated in Sorton prison. So there's no immediate danger to any other person here, whilst we loosely regard him as our strong suspect at this stage. We're learning, of course, about him, and we're learning that where he lives with his girlfriend, and from the girlfriend we learn of the existence of this other flat.
He actually had a flat adjacent to Elaine's on the same landing, obviously, and he used this as more of a postal drop. It was not really a flat that had been lived in.
After securing a warrant, detectives and forensic investigators gained entry to this other apartment. One of those present was forensic scientist Shirley Marshall.
The property, although it was very busy, there was lots of furniture and lots of electrical equipment and bits of debris around, which looked as if the person was into DIY or like an electrician type of a workshop type thing. What we try and do as forensic scientists is to be able to create links between things. Elaine was found in a bed. On that bed there were wooden posts, and we know that there were shards or pieces of fibres found behind the bed that appeared to be like blue polypropylene type rope. And then subsequently blue rope was found in Reid's property. We then had to take advice on the knot examination, because there were knots in the rope, and the rope was actually quite expertly spliced, which is something you don't see very often.
In order to get that advice, DCI Bert Swanson brought in an expert knot and rope specialist.
He explained, and what he said was that, to me, this is the type of knot that I would associate with someone who's a fisherman or has knowledge of working on the sea, would be using this type of it. And in addition to all of that, clearly we're looking at the background of who we're looking at. And indeed, lo and behold, we find that the person that we have in now as a strong suspect did in fact work on a fishing boat.
Back in the lab, Shirley Marshall was able to examine the rope further.
We did a microscopic examination under a low-power microscope to look for blood and traces of skin. Because if someone is bound with rope, then they tend to potentially get small pieces of skin trapped in it or surface rubbed off. And we did find some areas that appeared to be skin and also blood, which were DNA tested and matched back to Elaine. We did observe blood staining on the bedding and blood staining on Elaine's clothing that was being worn at the time. So we knew that there was the potential there for blood to be transferred to the assailant.
And surprisingly, Reed, being incarcerated, assisted the forensic investigation.
So we were also in the situation where he was in prison. He'd been arrested on the Friday of that bank holiday weekend, and his clothing was seized at that time. So we were able to look at his clothing that he was wearing on the Friday. Blood staining was found on the front of his jacket and also on his jeans.
And more connections to the crime were being discovered in Reed's flat, notably a cable for an electric blanket.
2 officers had been sent down to the electric blanket factory in the north of England, and they were actually on a phone call to the murder team with information from the factory about what the plug might look like from that electric blanket. So they were already looking for intelligence information in order to try and link that flex with the plug potentially to Elaine's electric blanket to see whether that had been removed from the crime scene and into Reed's property next door. I was involved in the examination of the cable for blood, which we did find, and that matched back to Elaine. So the cable with the plug attached that was found in Reed's property could be linked to matching the DNA profile of Elaine, and therefore linked back to her property. But also the identification branch looked very closely for, there were a number of small pieces of the white cable from the electric blanket were found in Elaine's property, but also a key piece was found on the floor of Reed's flat, if I remember rightly, between the kitchen and the lounge, and that became really key in being able to put a physical fit together to link that flex to the electric blanket next door.
Once again, items recovered during Reed's arrest will provide further evidence against him.
Looked at the video evidence from the police station, which there was in place at that time, the way in which he was processed, and in that I could see that he was emptied his belongings, his pockets onto that, and he had, amongst other things, a set of keys, and one of the sets of keys, the officer picked it up and says, "Is that an E on that? What's that?" And he never replied. And the officer didn't say anything further, just put it back in the property. So again, I go to Saughton prison, check that his property is there, what's happened to his property since he's been inside, and the set of keys were still there. Took possession of the set of keys from the prison, took it down to the flat at Muirhouse, and the one set opened the door of Elaine Colley, the deceased flat, and the other set opened the door of the accused flat next door.
In April 1999, police in Edinburgh were investigating the murder of 46-year-old Elaine Colley. She had been found dead in her bed in the city's Muirhouse area. Pathologists have found signs of blunt force trauma, sexual assault, and torture by electrocution using an electric blanket. Detectives and crime scene investigators had found a wealth of evidence in Elaine's flat and that of her neighbour, who was now the main suspect, John Jock Reid. Fortuitously, he was already in custody, having been arrested for offences including being drunk and incapable on the day of Elaine's murder.
We were informed by the major incident team that a suspect had come into the frame. When a comparison was carried out at a later date, we found a match for a thumbprint belonging to John Reid, which was great evidence because it placed John Reid in the flat handling the spectacles at some time.
The positive identification of these prints, along with forensic evidence found on the rope used to tie Elaine's wrist, the electrocution blanket, and images from a nearby ATM machine, all helped detectives to piece together how the murder happened, and possibly why.
Earlier in the day, he'd spoke to somebody who says, "You owe me £100. So he was wheeling and dealing in old cars. And at that stage, he says, "I don't have the money." He said, "Well, you have to get the money." So there was words exchanged. Now that became significant because he had said and given assurance to the guy, "Look, I'll get the money." So that's the same day as Elaine died. We know that Elaine went into her flat roughly about 4 o'clock because immediately after that, 11 minutes, I think it was, past 4, there was a phone call from her flat to what turns out to be the girlfriend of the accused.
Elaine's killer had actually knocked on her door and asked if he could use her phone to make an emergency phone call. And because she had probably seen him in the passing, more than once, he wasn't a stranger to her. Although she wasn't friendly with him, she knew his face to say hello to, so that there wouldn't have been any alarm or any sense of danger when Elaine answered the door to her killer that night.
DCI Bert Swanson had Reid brought from the prison where he was being held to Leith Police Station for questioning.
He admitted that he had gone into the flat to use the phone. He then said that he had come away from that and that he had got himself blind drunk and that the rest is a blank to him. He knows nothing else about it. It's very rare for them to actually give you a confession at that stage or to admit to any wrongdoing, and that's what happened here. So it wasn't a surprise to us, but equally there was a sufficiency of evidence for us to do what we were doing, so therefore we knew he was the guilty party at that time.
Reid was charged with the murder of Elaine Colley on the 21st of April 1999, just 16 days after her body was found. Presented with the overwhelming evidence against him, he pleaded guilty to her murder and to stealing £350 from her. Elaine's family travelled from New Zealand to attend the hearing held at the Edinburgh High Court later that year.
My father, my mother and I came back over for the court hearing, and we knew it was going to be a guilty plea and sentencing.
The accused himself had really nothing to say there. He had admitted that he was who he is, and that's all he's asked for. He's not asked for an explanation at this juncture in the court proceedings. It's beyond that. So he's there for the sentence, and that's what happened to him.
Reid was sentenced a month later. He was given a life sentence with a minimum prison sentence of 15 years before he could apply for parole.
But the murder and torture of Elaine wasn't Reid's only crime which came to light. There were other attacks and victims, some from many years earlier.
He had been accused of 3 further sex attacks in the past. When he left Dunbar, it emerged that he actually didn't leave of his own volition. He was actually run out of town because he had been accused of trying to rape a 14-year-old girl. The second sex attack that Reid was accused of was an attempt to rape a woman in a graveyard, and the only reason that he was unsuccessful was the woman's screams attracted passers-by and they chased him off. The third sex attack was on a male who he attempted to attack at a bus stop and was unsuccessful because the man managed to fight him off.
One of those previous victims, Nicola, was at home when police came to visit her, 15 years after she had been attacked.
I just said, "Do you know Jock Reid?" I says, "Yes. What can I do? Could we speak to you?" And when they told me, I couldn't believe it. I says, "I do not believe he's murdered somebody." When I phoned my dad, I says, "You're not going to believe this, he's murdered somebody, Dad." I says, "That could have been me."
The forensic evidence in this case was crucial. So many elements, so many different parts of forensic science kind of overlap. I think there were about 8 different scientific reports, lots of different experts involved. I mean, it is overwhelming.
John Reid died of COVID in 2021 while he was still incarcerated. One question remained unanswered and went with him to his grave: why he killed Elaine for just a few £100s.
Some of it is cruel beyond belief, but it's a tragedy. It's an unnecessary tragedy for anybody and everybody. I mean, if money was all he was seeking and needing here, he could have got money. He could have got the money. He could have got the cards. He could have achieved what he set out to do. So you have to say that he wanted more than just money.
But for Elaine's family, there were no answers as to why Reid had chosen her, and nor will there ever be.
She was a gentle, quiet person who lived her life as she wanted to. And what Reid did to Elaine has left a deep scar on my father. You know, he's her big brother. What she went through was horrific. She suffered horrendous physical and mental terror over a sustained period of time. And, like any family member, it's an impossible thing, but you wish that there was something you could have done to have changed it. I don't think we'll ever be able to get over it. What are we, 23 years since it happened? It still hurts. People say that the time's a great healer, but when you actually think of what went on, it is very difficult to still stay composed about.
Whenever there's a murder, it's the job of detectives to find out who the killer is and how they killed. And often it's forensic evidence which provides the clues.
The finding of his DNA wasn't just on the murder weapon, it was on a most important part of the murder weapon.
This evidence was the breakthrough that we needed.
The forensic evidence in this case was crucial.
In this series, we shine a light on how cutting-edge forensic techniques and the power of science brought the most dangerous killers to justice.
A truly horrific criminal, a monster.
It's a hammer blow. You don't know how you're going to carry on.
We'll hear how some of the most disturbing crimes were solved thanks to the tiniest fragments of evidence.
He basically said to me, she's in the house, go and find her.
The amount of blood that was there indicated that there was a frenzied attack.
There was no reasonable explanation for them. That's why he changed his plea.
And how even the most forensically aware of killers couldn't beat the experts and hide their crimes.
The key thing about having a DNA profile is you've got probably the sharpest tool in the box.
I was so elated beforehand. We didn't have the evidence, and all of a sudden, we'd cracked it.
In this episode, a horrific discovery on a picturesque beach.
It wasn't a normal crime scene because it was by the shore, and the police had to take into account the fact that the tide was coming in.
A finding that shocked police and the community of a small seaside town.
Some little girls have come across, whilst playing on the beach, a head and hands. They didn't know where the rest of the body was.
And a brazen killer caught on CCTV.
He's swinging it as he's walking along the road.
This is Forensics, Catching the Killer.
It was April the 1st, 2008, and it was on a morning not unlike this in terms of weather conditions. Very quiet. The school holidays were on at the time, so two sisters who lived nearby were on the beach, and they came down to play. And they saw something that aroused their curiosity. It was a bag, a plastic bag that had been washed up on shore. They decided to have a look at it. And what was inside filled them with horror.
Inside a supermarket carrier bag, wrapped in a bin liner, was a human head.
One can only wonder about what effect this had on these little girls, because to have made this sort of discovery as an adult would be traumatic enough. I think at the time, even their mother, because it was April the 1st, might have thought that it was some sort of hoax, but it soon became apparent that it wasn't. And the police were called, they came down here and very rapidly closed off the area. It became a major crime scene.
I received a call from the control room saying that two little girls had found what they thought was a head on the beach at Arbroath, and we were asked to attend.
Bob Sterling was a detective constable for Tayside Police at the time.
When I arrived there on South Street in Arbroath, I met up with two uniformed officers who were guarding the scene. So I made my way to the actual site and saw a black plastic bag. I gave it a cursory examination, and I could just see through it I could see human hair, and decided that this was real.
The beach was cordoned, and dozens of police were called in to search for more clues.
We were waiting on the identification branch to arrive, and I tasked one of the uniform officers to go and have a look to see if there was anything else before they actually arrived, and that's about maybe 50, 60, 70 yards away. He found another black bin liner with a pair of hands inside.
Word would have got round very, very quickly about what had happened here, and there's no doubt about it, this would have reverberated right throughout the county of Angus. To have body parts found on the beach would have set tongues wagging in a big way.
This is a friendly town, small compared to other places, and we just cannot believe that such a thing is happening in our town.
What was normally a quiet bit of beach here at Arbroath was transformed into a crime scene, and the police erected a tarpaulin. Forensics officers were on the scene, so it was a very much different look to what locals would normally see here. It wasn't a normal crime scene because it was by the shore, and the police had to take into account the fact that the tide was coming in. It was bringing all sorts of detritus in with it, so they had to make sure that they did what they could almost immediately in terms of searching, and also in terms of cordoning off the area. But they had to gather evidence as quickly as they could before it was destroyed.
For forensic pathologist David Sadler, the fast approaching tide meant not visiting the crime scene as standard practice would usually require.
Well, I first got a phone call when I was just in the office doing my routine work from an officer who was on the beach in Arbroath, and said they'd come across, or some little girls had come across whilst playing on the beach, a head and hands. They didn't know where the rest of the body was. They were still looking for the rest of the body. And they were progressing their forensic investigations on the beach, and they're just running the story past me to see if I wanted to go and have a look. Although time was tight, I think the tide might have been coming in, and I got the feeling that they'd rather carry on with their own forensic investigations rather than wait for me. So it was agreed that they would bring the body parts to me later in the day, having recovered them forensically properly, without waiting for me and risk the tide coming in.
While the forensics team continued to scour the beach for more clues, David Sadler began the post-mortem examination.
The cold water tends initially to preserve a body to some degree because it chills the body. So in a body that's drowned or even just found dead in the water from any cause, putrefaction might take a few days to get going. Cold water slows down the bacterial proliferation and it slows down the putrefactory process, which is a product of the bacteria present in and on the body. And in water, that tends to get washed away, and the cold environment tends to preserve the body to some degree until you take it out of the water. Then it seems to catch up. The fact that these body parts were quite fresh would suggest that they hadn't been in for more than a day or two, and the fact that they've been detached from the body probably offered some degree of protection and preservation as well, because most of the bacteria causing putrefaction will come from the bowel and the lungs and the airways and internally and spread throughout the body via the bloodstream, whereas with the detached head there isn't really a source of bacteria within the head that can cause accelerated putrefaction.
Armed with an estimated time of death, the task now was to find out where the body parts had come from and whose they were. In April 2008, in the Scottish seaside town of Arbroath, two young sisters made a terrifying discovery. A human head washed up on the beach inside a plastic bag. And while police began a major investigation, inhabitants of the town were left in shock.
The types of crimes you'd find in Arbroath are just the typical types of crimes that you would expect in any kind of town. You've got your assaults, you obviously have some kind of violence in those areas, but it's mostly house breakings, minor fracas that you might expect. No massive crime problem in the town at that time.
David Marsland was a reporter working for STV at the time.
People were absolutely terrified when this head was found. The two young girls who found it themselves told their mother that they were worried that whoever had done this was now going to be coming after them. But in the wider town as well, this is a genuinely horrific and shocking event, and people are asking questions, and clearly there was an impetus on what was Tayside Police then to find out who this was, what had happened to her, and who had done it.
Because the body parts had been washed up by the tide, there was speculation of how far they may have travelled. If the victim was local, it could be easier to identify her.
We did make investigation with the harbour master, and he was able to tell me that anything that's thrown from the harbour wall into the sea at that particular point will always get washed up on that beach. He more or less said there's no other possibility, high tide, low tide. If something goes in there, it always comes back onto the shore at South Street. He was quite adamant about it.
At the mortuary, pathologist David Sadler was working to establish the cause of death.
Whenever we just got a head and hands, it might be, we wouldn't necessarily expect to have the cause of death. If the deceased had been stabbed, for instance, then we'd expect to find the stab wounds on the torso, and the head might not show much. But in this case, there was enough subtle trauma to the head and face that gave us a good head start in establishing a cause of death. The head showed some signs of manual suffocation and smothering. In this case, it would appear that pressure to the mouth and nose had caused some bruising to the bridge of the nose, and also some abrasions and lacerations on the inside of the lips, where the lips have been pressed against the teeth, which would suggest manual pressure to the mouth and nose in a smothering and suffocation mechanism. Although we didn't have the usual signs of asphyxia, which is florid petechial hemorrhages around the eyes and the face, which you often see with compression of the neck, which causes the engorgement, and it shows the showers of petechial hemorrhages will appear in the eyes. We didn't have that, but we don't expect to see that with a smothering, because we don't get the pressure on the neck, we just have the pressure on the mouth and nose.
This is Arbroath Police Station. This is the scene where the incident room was placed. All the officers that were involved in it more or less worked from here, because this is the centre of the, obviously, investigation.
Initially, a photograph was taken of the head once it had been at the mortuary, and it was brought back to Arbroath Police Office and put on the incident board where the room was set up for the inquiry. And a female officer looked at it and thought she recognised the woman as being someone who'd assisted in an inquiry about a month before in Brechin. She thought she recognised the person as being a migrant worker who assisted as an interpreter in a previous inquiry, and she thought her name was Yolanta Bladaiti.
Jolanta Bladaiti was a 35-year-old Lithuanian woman who had moved to Scotland for work in 2006.
This woman had assisted in trying to identify who had perpetrated a robbery in Brechin about a month before on another migrant worker. And this is how this policewoman thought this was who it was. And she knew where she stayed and where she worked, because she worked in the agricultural industry. So inquiries, I think, were then made with her boss, who positively identified Jolanta Bladaiti.
So who was Jolanta?
Certainly at the time before Brexit, this area was a magnet for migrant workers, particularly from Eastern Europe, because they came here to make money in the berry fields and on other farms as well. Made money here during the summer and returned home during the winter.
It's a migrant community of, at that time, would have been about 4,000 people, so effectively everybody knew everybody.
Jolanta came from Lithuania, and she came from a rural area of Lithuania, and she had really a very sort of poverty-stricken upbringing. At some point, she apparently was inspired by her sister, who'd gone to live in Moscow, to travel abroad. So she did that, and I think about 2006 she went across to Ireland, then she came to Cornwall, and then she came up to Scotland. And I think the aim was to raise as much money as she could through working on farms to help support her parents, but there was also a suggestion that she wanted to get as much money as she could to go back to live in her home country and buy a place for herself.
She saved her cash, she did everything she could. She was extremely frugal, despite sending money back home to her sick father, who was dying from cancer. And she'd finally just about reached the level she needed for her deposit. She was planning to return home to Lithuania, buy that flat that she'd been looking for, when she was very brutally murdered.
With a name for the victim, police attention was drawn 14 miles away to Brechin, where Jolanta lived. Forensic scientist Alistair Burt was called in to examine her flat.
It was a first floor flat, had to go up past the half landing into the bed set. There was about 4 bed sets and a communal bathroom. All the furniture was in its normal place, and the flat looked relatively undisturbed. I examined a number of the rooms for blood. When I got to the bathroom, we discovered watery bloodstains under the carpet and in the bath, and that was the likely site where the body had been dismembered. You had to look quite carefully. You couldn't really see the bloodstains particularly well on the upper side of the carpet, but you could see them more clearly on the floorboards underneath. And we have a chemical test that you can use if you see a suspect stain. You can test it, and then there's a colour reaction if in the presence of blood. And that was a positive colour reaction that we got from the stains under the carpet and in the bath itself.
Forensics also uncovered shocking evidence that Jolanta may have been tortured before she was killed.
There was a cupboard on the half landing up to the first floor, and in there the crime scene investigators found a numerous lengths of tape that we subsequently discovered had been used to bind her, and a lot of that must have been wrapped around her head because there was numerous long human head hairs present on the tape. When hair has been forcibly removed, such as when it's been taped and then the tape has been pulled off, it removes the hair, including a sheath cell on the hair, and we were able to get a DNA profile that matched that of the victim. Also, there was a complete roll of tape, and I think there was a physical fit between the tape that was discovered in the bin cupboard and the roll of tape, so that you could say that tape came from that particular roll.
Forensics could now prove Jolanta had been tortured and then killed inside the flat. Outside, police discovered more forensic evidence as to who might have been the killer.
The police officers checked the bins, as they routinely do, to see if there's been any discarded items of interest, and they discovered overalls that were blood-stained, and we were able to get a DNA profile.
While the forensic team continued to search the building, detectives made door-to-door inquiries to see who knew Jolanta and what the motive for her murder could be.
When police found out where Jolanta lived, they also discovered who she was living with. One of the people there was a man, 19-year-old, called Alexander Skarda, who Jolanta had believed to be her friend. She had known him almost all the time that she had been in Arbroath. He had overheard her talking about the money that she had saved and her excitement that she was going to be going home to buy her own house, which is something that she had always wanted to do. That's why she was in Scotland.
Witnesses told police that Skarda had recently been seen hanging around with another man, 40-year-old Vitas Plitnikas. Could these two men help reveal how and why Jolanta had been killed? April 2008. Dismembered body parts found washed up on Arbroath Beach have been identified as that of Lithuanian agricultural worker Jolanta Bladaitė. With evidence mounting and witnesses placing them at the scene, two fellow Lithuanians, Alexandra Skarda and Vitas Plitnikas, were taken into custody.
There was forensic evidence found in the flat, blood staining, etc., and the plastic bags were found similar to the ones that had been found on the beach. And I had a receipt that was found as well regarding the purchase of the bags in a shop in Brechin. They were subsequently interviewed separately.
DNA swabs were taken from the suspects and compared to blood samples and overalls found in Jolanta's flat.
We weren't looking specifically for DNA that matched Skarda at the crime scene, because you'd expect to find that anyway, given that he lived there. So we looked for things that are out of the ordinary. We got blood stains on the outside of the overalls which matched that of Jolanta, and we also managed to get DNA profiles from the inside of the overalls, where people are likely to leave DNA if they've been wearing the overalls. And we got DNA profiles that matched that of Skarda.
When they were questioned initially, they denied any involvement, and Skarda especially had said he'd no idea where she was, and he knew her. So, but eventually it was Skarda who decided to tell the truth, and gave a statement to the effect that what had happened was between the three of them in the house in Brecon, and she had been murdered, and they had cut the hands and the head off in the bathroom of the house. He was a young man, and I think the pressure just got to him, really, because he'd been interviewed so many times that he was backed into a corner. I don't think he could actually find a way out other than just eventually come away with the truth. Whereas Bonitis he was twice as old as him, and he probably thought, I could keep spinning this out as long as I can, but Skerda didn't. It was one against the other.
Plotnikas was a former Red Army soldier, and there were rumours that he might have been involved in the war in Afghanistan all these years ago. But he just looked like a pretty fearsome character. And on the other hand, Skerda was much younger, only 19 years old. He looked like butter might not melt in his mouth.
The two of them hatched a plot to kill Jolanta Bladaite and take all that money that she had worked so hard to earn. They had a time pressure on them because she was about to leave Scotland to go home to Lithuania.
I think they believed that Jolanta had somewhere in the region of £7,000 in her bank account, a TSB account, and they fully intended to get as much of that as they possibly could. I think their idea was to try and do withdrawals before and after midnight so they can get the maximum amount.
Police then set about tracking their movements around the time of Jolanta's murder.
It was a couple of days, before we got all the downloads and had a look at it and see what He was actually quite easy to identify because he had a pronounced limp. And the pair of them just were completely mismatched. They were sort of 20 years apart and different heights and builds, etc. So once you'd seen them, you could quite easily identify them walking through the town.
CCTV showed the pair travelling for well over an hour by bus, carrying the plastic bag that contained Jolanta's severed head.
They got the bus from Brecon to a little village called Freecombe, and then got another connecting bus from Freecombe to Arbroath. And they get off the bus, Catherine Street in Arbroath, and they're seen walking down the road, and it's Skerda that has the head, and he's swinging it as he's walking along the road. Bonitis is walking on crutches at this point due to an injury that he had previously when he'd been a soldier in the Russian army. And then they went down towards the harbour and threw the head in the water in the hands.
And then they were seen again on CCTV, this time transporting a suitcase.
The next day they got a lift from another friend of theirs who took them in his car with the suitcase in it.
Liddell's car park is just at the back of the police station there, and that's where the car was. They dropped off with the suitcase. The car parked and they dropped off with the suitcase, and then walked in that direction to head towards the harbour.
Just like Skerda and Plotnikas had done with the carrier bag holding Jolanta's head, they tossed the suitcase containing the rest of her body, weighed down with bricks, off the harbour wall.
I think that the pair of them probably very inexperienced in sort of tidal matters and what have you, would assume that everything would be swept right out, which wasn't the case. I think it was just basic naivety as far as they're concerned regarding that.
police divers went into the water there, and they quite quickly found the suitcase with Jolanta's torso in it that had been thrown in. Well, part of the thinking of Plitnikas and Skirda was that if they dismembered Jolanta's body, they would effectively make her disappear and perhaps make people think that she earned enough money, she reached the target, and that she'd gone home to Lithuania.
Other witnesses were found who'd sort of seen them in the area, and they got hold of the guy who drove the car with the suitcase in it, and he gave a statement to that effect.
The second find of the torso really didn't add very much in terms of the cause or mechanism of death. We were fairly happy with the cause of death from our examination of the head. So really it was a case of just completing the anatomy really and putting the body back together. So at least now we had a complete find and a complete body, and that's important to have a complete body to give back to the relatives. That in itself was a success.
Alexander Skirda was not really all that well known to the police, but Plitnikas definitely was. He was a disqualified driver, and he dabbled in a lot of things, petty thefts, etc. So he was known, without a doubt.
As more evidence mounted against the two, Skirda divulged further information during his police interview.
Plitnikas had money worries. He wasn't working, and he wasn't claiming he didn't get any state benefit. But it was basically just he didn't have much at all, and that was the reason that it was carried out. Skirda didn't have any money either. He was quite poor.
There was evidence that someone had been using her bank card. And it turned out that they'd tortured Jolanta to give them her PIN number so they could take money out of her account.
Under further questioning, Skirda revealed more about what had been done to Jolanta before she died.
Skirda was the one who broke first, really. He did admit how the poor woman had been assaulted in the house and made to give up the PIN number. Initially she gave him the wrong PIN number, and Plitnikas had gone out to try and get money from a shop not far from where they stayed. Obviously it didn't work, and he came back in a rage, and eventually she gave up her PIN number, and they did get some money. But then at this time they decided that was it. She wasn't going to survive, and they made the conscious decision to kill her.
One can only imagine the terror felt by Jolanta when these two men burst into her room on that Saturday morning. There was quite a contrast between the brutish appearance of Plitnikas and the younger, more baby-faced look of Alexandra Skirda. Quite a contrast, but the fact that both these men carried out this murder says a lot.
A young woman brutally killed for her hard-earned savings. DNA from the blood found at Jolanta's flat, CCTV footage, and Skirda's confession meant police could now charge the pair with murder. On the 7th of April 2008, less than a week after the discovery of the dismembered remains of Jolanta Bladaiti, two men, Alexandras Skirda and Vitas Plitnikas, were charged with her murder. Detectives now had to compile enough proof to convict them both. But they faced one significant challenge.
We didn't find any DNA evidence to link Plitnicus to the crime scene at all. We suspected that his clothing had been cleaned. We had a mass of clothing to examine from Plitnicus, but we didn't find any DNA that matched that of Jolanta.
Plitnicus was only implicated through the CCTV evidence showing the pair disposing of the body parts, and despite that, he continued to deny any involvement. But in the end, the most compelling evidence against Plitnicus came from his own accomplice.
Trial took place at Edinburgh High Court. Skirda tendered a plea of guilty and gave evidence in the witness box against his co-accused, Vitas Plitnicus.
It was a slow case because everything had to be translated into Lithuanian, so it took quite a while. Skirda had implicated Plitnicus in the murder, and I was called to give evidence to help corroborate Skirda's story. Forensics was very important in this case because we were able to show that Jolanta had been killed and dismembered in her own bedsit. There was the bloodstains that were found in the bathroom, and they subsequently matched that of the victim. And we were also able to find that she'd been tied up or bound with tape because we found her hairs, or hairs that matched her at least, on the tape. We were also able to find overalls that were likely to have been worn by Skirda, and we were able to find blood that matched Jolanta on those overalls. If a person is found with bloodstains on their clothing and it matches that of the victim, then that's useful in securing a conviction. It depends on the circumstances, obviously. If the suspect said that they were helping the victim or had some reason to have the blood of someone else on their clothing, then that could be a possible explanation.
But there was no such explanation from Skirda as to why Jolanta's blood was on his overalls.
Skirda and Plitnicus were very different in court. Skirda, just a teenager, had broken down while being interrogated by police. It was Skirda who had confessed. It was Skirda who told them what they'd done. It was Skirda who had implicated Plitnicus. And inside court, he was humble. He was trying to give evidence. He was trying to explain what had happened under cross-examination, sometimes quite aggressive cross-examination. He had been relatively consistent in his story. Plitnicus, a former soldier in the Russian army, was belligerent. He was bullish. He lied in court. He claimed he wasn't there. He had this special defense of alibi, saying that he wasn't anywhere near the Brecon flat where Jolanta Plitnicus had been murdered. The jury saw through that pretty quickly.
At the conclusion of the trial, Plitnicus was found guilty and given a sentence of 28 years. He was subsequently deported. Skirda eventually ended up being given an 18-year sentence, which I believe he's still serving in Scotland.
Because of his cooperation with the police and trial, Skirda received a minimal life sentence. But Plitnicus showed no remorse for his brutal crime.
This will never be forgotten. In the annals of major criminal cases in Scotland, this is up near the top, and people here will forever associate this particular beach with this poor woman from Lithuania, a couple of thousand miles at least from her home, who met this dreadful fate. And I think the overall feeling about this is, amongst the community, is incredible sadness that it happened in the first place.
And it was that community that came together after Yolanta's death to support her family and pay tribute to the woman who had been washed up on the beach.
One of the tragic things about this case is that Yolanta Bladaioty's father, who she had been sending money home to because he was being treated for cancer, died before the verdict was made. And her family, who were impoverished, were unable to get to Scotland. And so they had a spokesperson there, a friend of Yolanta's from Brecon, who spoke about the family's grief at the loss of this wonderful woman. And that, plus the circumstances of her death, really affected the people of Brecon and Arbroath and the county of Angus, where those two towns lie. And there was a fundraiser because her family couldn't bring Yolanta home. And it raised around about £16,000. Just the ordinary people of Arbroath and Brecon and surrounding areas putting their money in to send this Lithuanian girl home. It's quite a remarkable thing.
Following the memorial and fundraiser, Yolanta's remains were repatriated back to her family. And she was finally buried there, in her hometown of Alytus.